the continent-wide response strategy, the creation of an African special fund for the COVID-19 response, the mobilization of health equipment, the training of African healthcare professionals, the deployment of special envoys on all fronts, all that we're doing to reduce, suspend, indeed cancel debt are some of the fronts we are fighting on in this wide-scale African response. We have been working with various different bodies, including the African CDC, and many of our continent-wide organizations have proven their mettle and their effectiveness and efficiency in response to this pandemic. This pandemic has made it abundantly and painfully clear that humankind is one indivisible family. It has shown that unilateralism is on a hiding to nothing, but it has also shown into stark relief the roadblocks that stand in the way of fully effective multilateralism, and has thrown into stark relief the artificial borders that have been erected between different members of the human family. Africa calls upon all of us to show our determination and to pull together our intelligence and our response in order to ensure a renaissance of multilateralism which stands on our common values. The experience we're currently undergoing, I think, has shown that the people of the world are hungry for effective global governance that can really deliver for them. Before I conclude, I would like to hail the partnership that exists between the African Union and the United Nations and express my gratitude for the leadership and the personal commitment and engagement of the Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres. I wish you every success in your deliberations and endeavours, and I thank you very much indeed for your kind attention.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Moussa Faki Mohamed for his briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as President of Niger. Heads of State and Government, Secretary General of the United Nations, Chairperson of the African Union Commission, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you very warmly for your effective participation in this high-level meeting of ours. In my capacity as President of the Security Council, it is my honor to be able to have an exchange with you on what the global governance post-COVID-19 should be. Only a crisis, felt as such, leads to a change. It is being said, well, we had the opportunity to really change things at the 2008 during the financial crisis, but we now have the COVID-19 opportunity to change the global governance. What are the challenges of our time, and what kind of governance can rise to these challenges? The first challenge is a global political governance. In this regard, during the 74th General Assembly session, I already stated that there is a need to support the Secretary-General in his efforts aimed at reforming our organization so as to put together a multilateral system which is more democratic. What prevailed 75 years ago is no longer valid today. The functioning of the General Assembly, of the Economic and Social Council, of the Security Council needs to meet the actual situation in the world. In particular, on the issue of the Security Council, where we're meeting today, all of the regions of the world, including Africa, have to be equitably represented. The number of permanent seats has to be increased, and the right of veto has to be removed or extended to the new permanent members to make sure that the body is democratic and equitable. Africa has a common position on this, and it is expressed in it as a winning consensus. As regards the General Assembly, the constant request from the member states is to make sure that there is a balancing of powers between the Assembly and the Security Council. the challenges we are facing on peace and security. When it comes to the limits of peacekeeping operations, we need to make sure there are collective decisions here, and greater powers are provided under Chapter 7. Notions and realities to develop, and the United Nations has to follow suit. International peace and security are threatened from non-state and terrorist organizations. And to this cannot be accommodated when some states have the right of veto, when they can block the decisions by the international community, even when we have a collective threat, and to do this on the basis of their own interests or ambitions. Furthermore, the risk of a state-to-state confrontation, in particular amongst major states, is not zero. If one of these states falls into this kind of trap, is not to be excluded. So the international community has to think about the possibility, in particular through thinking about denuclearizing the planet. The third challenge is deepening inequalities. Inequalities between countries and inequalities within countries. The difficulty is not in the shortage of ideas, but rather is trying to avoid the old ideas. And that is why the world usually undergoes reform under a shock. What we have now came in after the oil shocks in 73 and 79. Well, this resulted in such inequalities that the world finds itself in a situation similar to where it was at the end of the 19th century, and the divide between the rich and the poor is deepening, and the middle class is weakening. The gap between the rich and the poor is greater today than it was in the antiquity, where the economy was based on slavery. All of these specialists are saying that in the present context, the trend is going to only increase. And this growing inequality is a great threat that the world community has to face. And let me go back to Article 1 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and let me quote that people are born equal and in possession of all rights. We cannot have a situation which is based on common inequality. They're not always justified. So what we have now is incompatible with the principles of social justice, which is the very foundation of democratic society. And experience shows that the invisible hand of the market cannot correct them. To reduce inequalities, we need not only to invest in training and education, but also to implement expansionist policies and put together a tax on financial transactions, or even a progressive tax on capital. And this would allow to put an end to tax competition which exists among states today. Combating inequalities means that the international financial institutions and the World Bank Group have to work here. The fourth challenge we have is combating poverty. We need to build a world without poverty. And the world without poverty is the very motto of the World Bank. Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that any and all person has a right to a sufficient level of being to provide for his health and well-being of him or herself and her company, to health, housing, and the basic social services. The persons have the right for security in case of unemployment, old age, widowhood, or other cases where means of subsistence are lost, which happened beyond their control. End of quote. And in order to ensure this, we have to declare war against poverty. There is enough wealth in the world to eradicate poverty, and we can vanquish it. Hunger and illness are the two horsemen of apocalypses, and we have to combat them, and we can do that. And these create a fertile ground for terrorism, for example. And that is why an open and candid discussion has to start about basic universal rights for each individual. Experience shows that a universal income, for example, does not lead to laziness. In Niger, we have a proof of that. We have an unconditional transfer of money for the benefit of the most vulnerable. Fighting against poverty and unemployment also means sharing the work time and a reform of global economic and financial institutions, and putting an end to the kind of globalization which allows for the free circulation of capital, goods, and services, but refuses to allow for free circulation of people. Only 3% of the global population live outside of their country of origin. In Africa, where 90% of poor people live, fighting poverty means massive funding in order to implement the Agenda 2063. The next challenge, ladies and gentlemen, has to do with climate change. Since the beginning of the industrial era, we had models of development which are aggressive towards nature, and this redounds to our disadvantage through extreme climate events, hurricanes, storms, floods, droughts, melting glaciers, rising levels of seas and oceans, coastal erosion, new illnesses, depleting biodiversity, etc. These are all obvious signs of this. Intergovernmental group of climate experts have consistently been drawing attention to global warming. Our method of production is harmful for the environment and for the planet as a whole. World Wildlife Fund considers that about 40% of wildlife species are in the process of disappearing. New paradigm with COVID-19 also has to take this into account and call for a complete and urgent implementation of the Paris Agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, we therefore have to face facts and acknowledge that the instruments we had at the end of the Second World War are not sufficient for us today to put an end to poverty, social inequality, climate change, terrorism, organized crime, cybercrime. It is not enough to make sure that we have peaceful coexistence throughout the world. COVID-19 pandemic is the end of an era. It brought into focus for us the need to rethink our collective security system. It also showed us the very nature of our humanity, where all of the countries have found themselves in the same situation, going through the same trouble, powerful or not, rich or poor. We therefore have to all work together in order to draw lessons and think about the necessary reforms necessary for global governance. We have to have a post-COVID-19 world which brings peace, solidarity, and prosperity for all. A world where people live with dignity and equality in justice and freedom. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank His Excellency the President of the Security Council, President Issoufou, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, President of South Africa.
President, Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Moussa Faki, the Chairperson of the AU Commission, allow me to begin by congratulating you, Mr. President, and the Republic of Niger on assuming the presidency of the Security Council. Please be assured of South Africa's full support and cooperation. The threat to lives, livelihoods, and social stability posed by COVID-19 has significant consequences for global peace and security. Situations of instability and conflict have the potential to worsen, and there is a possibility of new forms of social unrest that are emerging. Vital gains made in political processes towards peace are also under threat. It is our collective expectation as the international community that the United Nations Security Council will continue to play a key role in ensuring that this pandemic does not undermine international peace and security in any country in the world. It is imperative that the Security Council continues to work closely with regional organizations in this regard, and in our case in Africa, including the African Union. We must coordinate our efforts and strengthen multilateralism if we are to contain the damage that this pandemic could cause. South Africa and the African Union supports the call by the UN Security Secretary General for a global ceasefire and the scaling up of humanitarian assistance to vulnerable societies around the world. South Africa calls on all parties to armed conflict to use this opportunity to work towards peaceful resolution of conflicts, and all of them addressing the humanitarian needs of their own populations. We further support the call for the waiving of unilateral punitive measures, such as sanctions, during the pandemic to enable affected countries to secure much-needed supplies and support. To maintain peace and security, we need a Security Council that better reflects and represents the United Nations membership in keeping with the principle of sovereignty and equality of all nations. This will ensure that the interests of a few will not undermine the efforts at finding solutions to emerging crises that are global in nature. As we look to the post-COVID era process of reconstruction, we have to address the economic, social, humanitarian, and environmental needs of countries. We have to act with urgency to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. As the international community let us choose cooperation above unilateralism. And we would also say it is best to choose solidarity above isolation. We should also have the courage to choose unity of purpose above narrow self-interest. I'm sure that we can emerge from this great adversity strengthened and even more united. Mr. President, I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Ramaphosa for his statement, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Kersti Kaljulaid, President of Estonia.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Secretary General, and my thanks also go to Mr. Moussa Faki Mohamed.
Great to be with you all and discuss the post-COVID governance in our global world. First of all, of course, I would like to reiterate Estonian support to the Secretary General Guterres' call for global ceasefire and call everybody to support it by the end of the year. COVID-19 has changed our world, and true to Estonian colours, I would like to point out that the technological development is the area which helps us to maintain the coherence of our world and to continue to cooperate with each other. In addition, this pandemic has shown us that our world of work, education, communication, services has radically changed. What we now need to do, we need to adapt our global governance model to what we are seeing in the real world. It is also, if we wish to make it so, a global opportunity and a golden opportunity potentially to those countries who are looking to leapfrog. For those people who have the skills to participate in the global services market, but you happen to come from the countries from where it is difficult to offer your services for the rest of the world. For those in the world, notably women, handicapped people, who have found it very difficult to participate in the job market previously. Now, in this post-COVID world, it has been proven that you don't have to be where you are working. This is a golden opportunity to weaker in our society. Also, we have to understand that we have to give our children and adolescents the opportunity to learn the skills necessary to participate in this new world of technology. And finally, we need not a national, not a regional like European Union, but even a global governance structure, which will create legally permissive environment for all these developments, including, of course, the necessary cyber security. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening, Estonia.
I thank Her Excellency for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Kais Saied, President of Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to congratulate your brotherly country, Niger, on its able leadership of the Security Council during the months of September. I would like to thank you for organizing this high-level meeting at the Security Council and for choosing the appropriate theme of global governance post-COVID-19. The theme reflects our common conviction that the Security Council must play a vital role in addressing the repercussions of the pandemic on international peace and security and on other fields. I would also like to thank the Secretary General of the United Nations for his valuable briefing. I reiterate Tunisia's unwavering support for his constructive initiatives to enhance the work of the organization and to mobilize international efforts to help countries and people around the world to fight the pandemic and to stem its repercussions. I would also like to thank the chairperson of the African Union Commission for his statement and for the continued efforts by the Commission and the AU Peace and Security Council to silence the guns in various parts of our continent and to enhance the capacities of African countries to fight the pandemic. Mr. President, 9 months have passed since the outbreak of the pandemic. It has spread around the world, and its impact on all countries and people, without exception, has become more and more dramatic. The international community has become increasingly aware of the repercussions of COVID-19 on international peace and security, not only in conflict zones, where it has contributed to deepening existing crises and humanitarian tragedies, and complicating situations that are already tense. The pandemic has also affected other regions, adversely impacting the economic, social, and political situation, and international relations as well. Unfortunately, the repercussions of the pandemic might be felt for generations. They might not disappear with the disappearance of the virus. They threaten to intensify tensions between international powers, cause shifts in the regional balances of power, and weaken multilateralism. In this regard, I fully agree with the Secretary General in his description of the current crisis as, and I quote, "the greatest test the international community has faced since the organization was formed," end of quote. Tunisia was one of the first countries to draw the attention of the international community to the impact of the pandemic on humanity as a whole and its destructive effects on peace and security and all aspects of life. In this context, I called for adopting a new approach towards international security based on enhancing cooperation and synergy among countries and people, as we believe that no single country, no matter how powerful it might be, would be able to confront this invisible enemy, this transnational enemy, alone. We all have the same fate. Our collective peace and safety depends on the peace and safety of every single individual without exception. Against this background, Tunisia in coordination with France proposed a draft resolution to the Security Council in a second phase, where we stressed that fighting the pandemic requires more international solidarity, a comprehensive, coordinated, common, coherent response under the supervision of the United Nations. We called for a comprehensive and immediate ceasefire all around the world. We called for observing a humanitarian truce in all conflict zones. In line with the Secretary General's call. We express our appreciation to the Security Council for unanimously adopting said resolution on the 1st of July 2020. Today, we stressed the importance of implementing this resolution and following up on this implementation by relevant parties, especially in light of the deterioration of the humanitarian situation in a number of conflict zones as a result of the pandemic, such as Syria, Yemen, Libya, the Sahel region, Afghanistan, and other regions. The adoption of said resolution sent a positive message on the engagement of the Council in the fight against COVID-19. However, it took 4 months of arduous negotiations that showed the deep divisions inside the Security Council. They have adversely affected the ability of the Council to address the issues on its agenda, especially protracted issues that have deep effects at all levels, chief among which the just Palestinian cause. This proves that we need to accelerate the process of reforming the Security Council so that it becomes more flexible, so that the decision-making process becomes faster and more flexible. Mr. President, the immediate and direct consequences of the pandemic on the global health situation should not obscure the social and economic impacts. It expected that the economic consequences will be the worst since the last century, or maybe in the history of humanity. All indications suggest that the global economy will see a contraction of more than 5%. It is likely that this will be followed by a financial crisis in many parts of the world that will ravage the economies of many countries and that will push millions of people toward.
This is now a useful tool to boost the implementation of the Paris Agreement around the region. Along the same vein, the Great Green Wall Initiative has also allowed us to build a more sustainable and equitable future and to give life to our vision of being neutral in terms of land degradation. By keeping our land healthy and by prioritizing nature-based solutions, we will also be able to preserve as well our people's health. President, a century ago, when the Spanish influenza struck a world already destroyed by the Great War, very few multilateral institutions existed. Countries tackled the pandemic with means that we didn't have today, and they learned a lot from this. Today, the World Health Organization has become the most relevant multilateral framework that we have at our disposal. And it allows us to take concerted action to tackle epidemics. Other multilateral institutions, such as the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the IMF, are also tools that allow us to build our collective capacity to solve global problems. We urge Member States to support the efforts of the Secretary-General to reform the organisation and to strengthen its role and to give it the capacity to allow it to fulfil its mission adequately. Niger once again reiterates its commitment to the common African position as enshrined in the Esselwini Consensus. The multilateral system that was born after the Second World War allowed us to define and implement norms and principles that were based on human development. Today, the respect for the individual, the defence of freedom, the fight against poverty or epidemics are the priorities of the global multilateral system. Beyond institutional reform now, it is also within our societies that we can win this fight through far-reaching changes of our behaviour and our policies. We must invent an economy that respects human beings and the environment. President, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations is the opportunity for us to reflect on how we can make the UN more adept in how it addresses new challenges. We must preserve what we have gained thanks to multilateralism. If the international system continues